Italy is facing an economic crisis, one that has unfolded not in sudden collapse, but in slow motion, over the course of several decades. To the casual observer, it might seem surprising. This is a country with global recognition, cultural influence, and a long-standing seat at the table of major economies. It boasts a GDP of over $2 trillion, placing it among the top 10 largest economies in the world. Yet beneath these surface-level statistics lies a much more troubling reality. Italy is no longer growing. Its economy has remained virtually stagnant for over 20 years. The average Italian today earns less than they did 2 decades ago when adjusted for inflation, and economic output has barely moved since the early 2000s. This isn't just a temporary slump, it's a deep-rooted stagnation that reflects something more structural, more systemic. Despite recent headlines about falling youth unemployment, Italy is experiencing one of the largest brain drains in the developed world. Tens of thousands of educated, skilled workers are leaving the country every year in search of better opportunities abroad, taking with them the human capital vital to innovation and productivity. Between 2008 and 2016 alone, this outflow of talent cost the Italian economy an estimated €14 billion money that will likely never be recovered. And that figure doesn't even begin to account for the future losses in innovation, entrepreneurship, and tax revenue that such an exodus creates. At the same time, Italy's population is rapidly aging. Its birth rate has fallen to record lows, and with fewer young people entering the labor market, the burden on the state to support older generations continues to grow. Welfare spending now accounts for nearly 1/5 of the entire economy, and debt levels have climbed to alarming heights, 144% of GDP. Placing further strain on the country's ability to invest in the very things that could revive its productivity and competitiveness. So how did it come to this? How did a country once celebrated for its post-war recovery and economic dynamism fall into such persistent decline? To answer that question, we need to look back to the years of rapid growth that followed World War II and the slow unraveling that began in the decades that followed. This is the truth about Italy's economic crisis. And to understand what's going wrong today, we first need to understand what went right and when it all started to fall apart. To truly understand Italy's current economic crisis, we need to go back to a time when the country was thriving, a period known as the Italian economic miracle. In the decades following the devastation of World War II, Italy underwent a dramatic transformation. Between 1950 and 1980, the country experienced rapid industrialization, rising incomes, and significant improvements in quality of life. Factories were built, cities were reconstructed, and a new wave of prosperity swept across the nation. GDP soared, and productivity surged. Italy was no longer the war-torn country of the 1940s. It had become a rising economic power. Several factors fueled this explosive growth. One was the Marshall Plan, through which the United States provided over $1.2 billion in aid to Italy between 1947 and 1951. This funding helped rebuild the country's infrastructure and industrial base. Another was Italy's geopolitical position during the Cold War. Strategically located between Western Europe and the Mediterranean, Italy became a crucial ally of the West and a key member of NATO. This alignment brought political stability and access to new markets. But perhaps most importantly, Italy had the right combination of labor and demand. A large, young workforce powered the growth of a booming manufacturing sector. Demand for Italian goods, especially textiles, machinery, and automobiles, rose sharply, both domestically and abroad. The creation of the European Common Market in 1957, which reduced trade barriers between European countries, gave Italian businesses access to a much larger customer base. As trade flourished, so did Italy. During this time, productivity was the engine of growth. Economists often refer to this as total factor productivity, a measure of how efficiently labor and capital are being used together. In Italy, this metric climbed rapidly in the post-war years, contributing to more than half of the country's economic growth during the miracle period. Workers were producing more with less, and that increase in efficiency translated directly into higher national output and rising living standards. But by the 1970s, cracks had begun to appear. The miracle was over. A combination of domestic and international shocks, rising inflation, oil crises, labor unrest, and political instability began to slow the momentum. Italy's economic growth didn't stop entirely, but it began to lose its foundation. The very driver that had powered its earlier boom, productivity, started to stall. And this wasn't just a temporary setback. Over the next 5 decades, Italy's total factor productivity would decline by nearly 14%. The country was still working, but it was no longer getting better at how it worked. In response to the slowdown, Italy tried to stimulate growth through short-term fixes, deficit spending, currency devaluations, and loose monetary policy. While these measures provided brief relief, they did little to address the underlying issues. The structural problems, the ones tied to efficiency, innovation, and competitiveness remained untouched. And without reforms, the miracle gave way to mediocrity. Today, the economic legacy of that golden age is a complicated one. Italy rose quickly, but it never adapted to the modern economy in the way its peers did. And now, the country finds itself stuck, unable to replicate its past success, and increasingly vulnerable to the very forces it once overcame. Despite its promising past, Italy's economy has now entered a prolonged period of stagnation. One of the clearest signs of this is its real GDP, which, after adjusting for inflation, has barely moved since 2005. In other words, the Italian economy has made no meaningful progress in nearly 2 decades, while other major European economies rebounded after the 2008 global financial crisis and even the COVID-19 pandemic. Italy has remained stuck. The consequences of this stagnation are visible in everyday life. Real wages have declined, meaning that the average Italian earns less today when adjusted for inflation than they did 20 years ago. In comparison, countries like Slovenia have seen steady income growth during the same period. Among all major European economies, Italy has experienced the sharpest drop in real wages. This isn't just a matter of numbers, it reflects deeper economic dysfunction. Italy's workforce isn't less capable, but the conditions for growth have weakened. Low productivity, outdated systems, and missed reforms have created an economy that spins its wheels without moving forward. For a country of its size and potential, this long-term stagnation is not just unusual, it's alarming. At the heart of Italy's economic stagnation is a deep and persistent productivity crisis. For decades, productivity, the amount of economic value produced per worker, has either flatlined or declined. One key measure of this is total factor productivity, TFP, which accounts for how efficiently labor and capital are used together. In Italy, TFP has fallen by 13.7% since 1970, and in recent years it has actually become a drag on economic growth rather than a driver of it. This is a serious problem. Productivity is what allows a country to grow without simply adding more workers or capital. It means getting better, not just bigger. And yet, Italy's workers today produce less value per unit of input than they did in the past. One estimate found that the value added per worker declined by 5% over time, an outcome that's virtually unheard of among advanced economies. So what's holding productivity back? Much of it comes down to inefficiency in the public sector. Italy's labor market is burdened with complex regulations, and its judicial system is notoriously slow, making it hard to resolve disputes or enforce contracts. These delays discourage investment, limit business growth, and reduce incentives to innovate. Research has shown that in provinces where public sector efficiency is higher, output per worker is significantly greater, sometimes more than double. This kind of inefficiency is not just inconvenience, it's costly. It creates an environment where starting and running a business becomes harder, especially for new or small enterprises. As a result, Italy sees fewer startups, less competition, and slower adoption of modern technologies, all of which feed back into the productivity problem. Italy's productivity crisis isn't evenly spread. It's shaped by a sharp regional divide between the industrialized north and the underdeveloped south. In northern Italy, cities like Milan, Turin, and Genoa form what's known as the industrial triangle, a hub of modern industries, advanced manufacturing, and relatively efficient public services. Productivity in these areas is far higher, and businesses are better supported by infrastructure and local governance. In contrast, southern and central Italy continue to struggle with high unemployment, lower education levels, and an economy that still leans heavily on subsidized agriculture and public spending. Public sector efficiency is much lower in the south, and firms operating there often face more red tape, slower services, and weaker support. According to one analysis, a firm in the north produces nearly double the economic output per euro spent on employees compared to a similar firm in the south. This divide is not new. It has deep historical roots, but its persistence is a major obstacle to national economic progress. The lack of consistent investment in infrastructure and human capital across all regions has made Italy's economy deeply imbalanced. And unless this gap is addressed, it will continue to drag down the country's overall productivity and growth potential. Alongside economic stagnation and regional inequality, Italy is now facing a severe demographic crisis, one that threatens the very foundation of its future workforce. The country's birth rate is the lowest it has been in 50 years, and its population is rapidly aging. Today, Italy's population pyramid is top-heavy, with a growing number of retirees and fewer young people entering the labor force to replace them. This shift has serious consequences. An aging population means a shrinking workforce, which makes it harder for the economy to grow, especially when productivity is already declining. Fewer working-age people also means fewer taxpayers and a larger burden on the state to fund pensions, healthcare, and social services. Already, welfare spending accounts for nearly 19% of Italy's GDP. and this share is likely to increase as the demographic imbalance worsens. Making matters worse is Italy's ongoing brain drain. Every year, tens of thousands of young, educated Italians leave the country in search of better opportunities abroad. These are exactly the kinds of workers Italy needs to maintain its economic competitiveness. Yet they are disappearing at an alarming rate, and as they leave, so does the potential for innovation, entrepreneurship, and long-term growth. In combination, these demographic trends create a vicious cycle: fewer workers, higher dependency ratios, rising public costs, and declining economic momentum. Without a clear plan to reverse the decline in births and retain skilled talent, Italy's demographic disaster will only deepen its economic crisis. Italy's economic challenges are made even more difficult by the weight of its public debt, which is among the highest in the world. As of now, Italy's debt-to-GDP ratio stands at 144%, meaning the country owes significantly more than its entire economic output in a year. This massive debt load limits the government's ability to invest in critical areas like infrastructure, education, or innovation, because so much of its revenue is diverted toward interest payments, just to stay afloat. High debt isn't necessarily a problem if an economy is growing quickly, but in Italy's case, slow growth makes repayment harder. Without a sharp increase in productivity or significant fiscal reforms, the country struggles to generate enough income to reduce its debt burden. In fact, some estimates suggest that if Italy didn't have to service so much debt, it would be running a primary budget surplus, meaning it would take in more revenue than it spends. But that's not the reality. Instead, Italy finds itself caught in a deficit debt spiral, where weak growth leads to more borrowing, and more borrowing leads to further cuts in growth-friendly spending. Without bold changes, this dynamic becomes self-reinforcing, especially as global interest rates rise and borrowing becomes more expensive. For Italy, breaking free from this trap is critical, but with limited room to maneuver. The path forward is steep and uncertain. In September 2022, Italy elected Giorgia Meloni as prime minister, bringing the right-wing Brothers of Italy party to power for the first time. Her election marked a major political shift, and it was met with skepticism both inside the country and across Europe. Many questioned whether her government would take the bold steps needed to address Italy's long-standing economic problems or simply follow the same ineffective policies of the past. Since taking office, Meloni has made reducing the fiscal gap between government spending and revenue a central focus. One of her most controversial moves has been the rollback of welfare programs, including the phasing out of a basic income support scheme for low-income households. Her government argues that this will shift the system from one of dependency to one of work-based assistance, though critics warn that vulnerable groups may be left behind. Meloni has also introduced measures aimed at tackling the demographic crisis. These include a 50% increase in baby bonus payments, extended maternity benefits, and incentives for large families. While these policies show an effort to address declining birth rates, it's too early to tell whether they will have a meaningful impact on long-term demographic trends. Some small gains have been made, deficits have begun to narrow, and projections suggest the budget may continue to improve gradually. But Italy's problems are deeply entrenched, and structural reforms take time. Meloni's government has signaled its intent to reshape the economy, but real transformation will require more than fiscal tightening and family incentives. It will demand sustained action across productivity, education, investment, and labor markets, areas that remain largely untouched. Italy's economic challenges are deep, complex, and decades in the making. What began as a gradual slowdown has turned into long-term stagnation marked by falling productivity, demographic decline, regional imbalance, and a towering debt burden. The country still holds economic weight on the global stage, but its foundation has been steadily eroding. While recent political efforts show a willingness to act, they are just the beginning. Reversing Italy's decline will take more than budget cuts and bonuses. It will require bold, structural reforms, streamlining bureaucracy, improving public sector efficiency, investing in human capital, and creating an environment where innovation and new business can thrive. Without these, the economy will likely remain stuck in a cycle of low growth and high debt. But Italy is not without potential. It has the talent, history, and resources to succeed. The question is whether it can confront the hard truths of its current crisis and commit to long-term change. Because without a clear break from the past, Italy risks falling further behind, not just in Europe, but in the world economy.